Okay, so the purpose of this video is to give you a quick overview of the main ideas of the first 60 pages or so of John Rawls' famous book, A Theory of Justice. Well, quicker than actually reading the first 60 pages. John Rawls only died about 14 years ago, but he started having strokes in the 1990s. So his last real contributions philosophically were in the 1980s. And his really most productive years were the 70s. John Rawls grew up real privileged. He was the son of a prominent attorney, grew up in Baltimore. He went to a fancy boarding school in New England for high school. An important event that happened in John Rawls' life was that he was one of 5 children, and 2 of his brothers died from communicable diseases that they got from him. So when he was young, Rawls got diphtheria, and while he didn't die from it, his younger brother, about a year younger than him, caught it from him and did die. And then a few years later, when he was older, John Rawls got pneumonia. And while he didn't die from the pneumonia, one of his other brothers caught pneumonia from him and died of it. So you'll kind of understand as we go along that these were really key events in John Rawls' life. He did serve in the army during World War II. In fact, he was in the infantry, so he saw really heavy fighting. Deep, trench warfare in the Philippines and in New Guinea, what's now Papua New Guinea. He was always extremely withdrawn and private, very devoted father and husband. He almost never gave interviews. He was sort of the opposite of Peter Singer and Martha Nussbaum, who kind of really liked the limelight. They liked being interviewed. They liked being on the lecture circuit. He would frequently be invited to give, important lectures at, big universities, and he almost always declined those invitations. He was just very, very quiet. He did struggle with a stutter He struggled with a stutter throughout his life, and while it didn't really impact his teaching, that may be one reason why he didn't like giving lectures. He taught several places before he ended up settling down at Harvard for 40 years. He taught almost all of today's really, really famous philosophers, the real heavyweights. Many of them studied with John Rawls. And John Rawls is probably America's most influential and well-known philosopher. Peter Singer is Australian, so we can't really lay claim to him, and he's probably the most influential living philosopher. But John Rawls is undoubtedly the most influential American philosopher. And his main work is A Theory of Justice, which was published in 1971. So there's this concept of thought experiments, which has been used in the sciences for a long time. The idea is if there's something you can't test out in a laboratory, then you should just do an experiment in thought, in your mind. And one of the more famous thought experiments was done by Albert Einstein. And he imagined what it would be like to chase a light beam. And he always said that this is how he really came up with the theory of special relativity, was through this thought experiment. You couldn't actually chase a light beam in a laboratory, so you had to do an experiment in thought. And a thought experiment is also often used in philosophy. And a thought experiment is at the very heart of A Theory of Justice. The name of the thought experiment is the original position. So the original position for Rawls is a purely hypothetical, non-historical, it's totally imaginary situation, but it is a contractual situation. So Rawls is in the long tradition of thinkers from Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who are in the social contract tradition. However, unlike some of those earlier thinkers, John Rawls doesn't think of his contractual situation as ever having really happened in history. It's just a thought experiment. Now, in this situation, the original position, individuals are called contractors, and they have to bargain. They have to agree in this situation. What are they bargaining on? What are they deciding on? They're deciding on the principles of justice for the basic structure of their society. So there's a couple things to note here. The principles of justice that the contractors choose in the original position are the principles that are going to be used to judge whether actual distributions of primary social goods in the society are just or unjust. So they're not deciding on the actual distribution, they're just deciding on the principles which will be used to judge. But there's this key term here, primary social goods. What are these things? Well, John Rawls says that primary social goods are goods that are so basic that everyone wants them, whether they have any particular, set of values. Whatever else you want these things. And they're goods that are really needed in order to realize any life plan. Whatever your goals are, you're going to need these primary social goods. And he makes a list of them. And the first one is rights. But he often uses the terms prerogatives or powers instead of rights, and it's better to understand rights in that way. These are things you're allowed to do. Then he includes liberties, which is closer to what we actually mean when we talk about rights. There's opportunities, there's income and wealth, and there's what he calls the social bases of self-respect. This is society mirroring back to you your own worth. So the social bases of self-respect include things like non-discrimination. Now, why are the primary social goods important? Well, if you look at an index of a person's rights and liberties, opportunities, income and wealth, and social bases of self-respect, then you have a pretty good predictor of his or her, what John Rawls likes to call life chances. An index of primary social goods, he thinks, is a pretty good proxy for a person's level of advantage or disadvantage. So, the principles of justice are what's being decided on in the original position. The exact distribution of these primary social goods is not being decided in the original position, just the principles. A second thing to note is that these principles that the contractors are agreeing on are only going to apply to the basic structure of society. Now, what is that? The basic structure of society includes things like the Constitution, the structure of the economy, the judicial system, the legal system, and things like that. The principles of justice are not going to be applied to individual actions, individual behavior. They're going to apply to how the basic structure of society functions in people's lives. Now, there are several assumptions that John Rawls makes about the original position. And he thinks these are pretty safe assumptions and pretty non-controversial. First, we have to imagine that all of the contractors are rational. They're capable of, drawing inferences and so on. He says, we're going to assume that all the contractors are self-interested. They're not out for like Hobbesian domination. They're not trying to be the Leviathan. They're just concerned to advance their interests. They'd prefer to have better outcomes in their lives than worse outcomes in their lives. And that's what he means by self-interested. And another assumption he makes is that the contractors are what he calls mutually disinterested. In other words, they're not motivated by principles of love for the other contractors. They're not in a position where they're ready to sacrifice for the other contractors. They're disinterested in the other contractors. So he thinks these are pretty safe assumptions, but the idea here is that the contractors won't agree on principles of justice unless they're convinced that the principles are going to afford them the best possible outcome. So, and then this is the key assumption about the original position. We have to imagine, Rawls thinks, that each contractor is behind what he calls a veil of ignorance. Now, behind this imaginary veil of ignorance, the contractors don't know what position they will eventually occupy in the society that they're agreeing on principles of justice for. They don't know their sex, whether they're male or female. They don't know their sexual orientation, whether they're cisgender, transgender, gay, straight. They don't know their gender. Sex is not gender. They don't know their gender identity. They don't know their race. They don't know their ethnicity. They don't know their socioeconomic status. They don't know what social class or status or position they will eventually occupy. They don't know their background, their parentage. They don't know how old they are. They don't know what set of natural abilities or disabilities they're going to have. They don't know about the kinds of gifts or assets or talents they're going to have. They don't know what kinds of challenges or obstacles they're going to have. They don't know their values. They don't know. John Rawls refers to this as a comprehensive doctrine. They don't know their moral worldview, like the overarching narrative through which you kind of interpret the world. They don't know their religion. They don't know any of this. So we have to imagine all of the contractors behind this veil of ignorance. Now, why is this the key assumption? Well, you have to imagine that the contractors are deciding on principles of justice, kind of like a roulette wheel, right? So while the wheel is still spinning, they have to decide on principles of justice. And each slot on this roulette wheel, you have an equal chance, right, of having the ball land in any of these slots. But the slots are actually identities. So, while the wheel is still spinning, you have an equal chance of being this person, this person, this person, this person, this person, any of those two people, this guy, this girl, this woman, this guy. Each one of these is a slot on the roulette wheel, and that could be the identity that you will actually occupy. And you have to decide on principles of justice while the wheel is still spinning. You just don't know. You could be any of these people, right? So, what does this assumption, the idea of the veil of ignorance, what does this accomplish? Well, for Rawls, it means that the contractors can't decide on principles of justice based on what they know will advantage them, in particular, over other people. So the veil of ignorance kind of cuts off a bargaining position for the contractors that would allow them to decide on principles that would help them more than others. So in this sense, the veil of ignorance as an assumption, Rawls thinks it bakes this idea of impartiality into the original position. If you could end up with any of the identities on that roulette wheel, the ball could end up in any of those slots, then you have to be impartial when you're deciding on principles of justice. Now, for Rawls, this assumption is really, really important because it keeps what he considers morally arbitrary considerations out of the basic social contract. And he thinks certain things are just morally arbitrary, like who your parents are, whether your parents are rich, whether your parents are poor, whether they're educated or uneducated, where you live, your community, your sex, your gender, all of the things you don't know behind the veil of ignorance. These things are morally arbitrary in the sense that they're just due to good luck or bad luck in either the lottery of genetics or the birth lottery. They're morally arbitrary in the sense that you don't deserve them. There's no deservingness or merit behind, who your parents are, who you're born to, where you end, what kind of life you end up living. It's morally arbitrary. And here, the experience of the death of his brothers I think it's really important. For Rawls, the fact that he was born with a stronger constitution, a stronger physical constitution, and his brothers were born with weaker constitutions was sort of morally arbitrary, and he experienced that arbitrariness firsthand. He didn't deserve, really, to be the one who lived in that situation, and his brothers didn't deserve, to be the ones with the weaker constitution who died. These are morally arbitrary things. So Rawls, in general, Rawls is really allergic to the idea that your life chances could be dictated by morally arbitrary things. So, to summarize, the original position is a hypothetical situation in which rational and self-interested and mutually disinterested agents who don't know their eventual identities or social positions agree on principles of justice for the basic structure of society. Now, in the original position, Rawls thinks if we imagine this through this thought experiment, there's only two principles that these contractors, under these conditions and assumptions, are going to agree on. And these are the two principles he thinks they're going to agree on. One is basically an equal rights principle. He calls this the equal basic liberties principle, or the EBL principle. Each person has the right to the most extensive set of basic liberties, which is compatible with everyone else having exactly the same set. So in other words, if one person gets more rights, but that means that other people can't have the same amount of rights, then you've reached the end, right? It has to be equal and maximal. So each person's set of basic liberties has to be as large as possible, but also each person's set of basic liberties has to be exactly the same as everyone else's. The second principle that Rawls thinks these contractors are going to agree on is the difference principle, commonly called the difference principle. And in this principle, the contractors are going to agree that social and economic equalities should exist and can exist, but they're going to limit those. They're going to put some conditions on the social and economic inequalities. They have to satisfy two conditions. The first condition is that social and economic inequalities have to be attached to positions, and Rawls often adds offices, that are legitimately open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. The second condition is that they have to benefit the least advantaged members of society. These social and economic inequalities can exist, but they have to benefit the least advantaged members of society. Rawls reformulated the second half of the difference principle several times throughout his work, and eventually he decided that the second condition was that these social and economic inequalities must be to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society. Now, examples of the equal basic liberties principle, the first principle, are, your basic rights of conscience, speech, association, and expression. Basically, Bill of Rights kind of liberties. Also, the right to vote and participate politically for citizens, for adults, regardless of their race, religion, and ability, and so on. This is an example of the equal basic liberties. Some people have said that same-sex marriage is the eventual decision of the Supreme Court to declare prohibitions on same-sex marriage unconstitutional is an example of the equal basic liberties principle. If straight people have the right to marry other consenting adults, then gay people should have the right to marry. Otherwise, you wouldn't have equal and maximal basic liberties. Some people have said that the Americans with Disabilities Act is a good example of equal basic liberties. If people without disabilities have the freedom to sort of go places and participate in social life by riding public transit and going into public buildings, then people with disabilities should be able to do the same thing. And so public buildings and public transit should be accommodating to those with disabilities. Those are a few examples of the first principles. So the first principle really deals with number 2 and number 5 on the list of primary social goods. Liberties, again, is sort of more commonly what we think of as rights. These have to be, under the first principle, distributed equally and maximally. And again, because the social basis of self-respect has to do with society mirroring back to you a sense of your own worth, and that includes things like not discriminating against you. The social bases of self-respect also have to be distributed equally and maximally. You can think of gay people who weren't allowed to marry before same-sex marriage was declared legal by the Supreme Court. That's a social basis of self-respect issue, right? It's a society saying you're less than. And same with people with disabilities, right? It's sort of a social basis of self-respect thing to say, well, you don't have access to public libraries or to, government buildings or to, ride the city bus. It's society telling you that you're less than. And so these kinds of things, Americans with disabilities and same-sex marriage, are about social bases of self-respect. So those two things have to be distributed equally and maximally under the first principle that the contractors agree on. The second principle deals with regulating inequality. So an example of the kind of social and economic inequality that Rawls has in mind here is this is about prerogatives. He calls these rights, but it's better to think of them as prerogatives. So only people who actually hold an elected office can actually vote on bills, like legislation. People like you and me, just ordinary voters, we can try and persuade them, we can call them up, we can write letters, but we don't get to vote, right? We don't have direct democracy. We don't have direct participatory democracy. We have representative democracy. So that's a prerogative that's distributed unequally, right? I mean, people who hold elected office have that prerogative, and ordinary people who don't hold elected office don't have that prerogative. Another example is, we've learned this, a lot in the last few weeks. Income is distributed unequally and wealth is distributed even more unequally. That's the kind of social and economic inequality that Rawls has in mind here. People in our country pay an unequal proportion of their incomes toward taxes. This is another kind of social and economic inequality. The point of the difference principle is that when you look at these inequalities, these kinds of social and economic inequalities, you have to ask two fundamental questions about them. One is, are the more advantaged positions, so people, positions that are associated with greater income, greater wealth, things like elected office, the more advantaged positions, are those more advantaged positions truly open to everyone in the society under conditions of what Rawls calls fair equality of opportunity? The second question you have to ask about these inequalities is, do they benefit the least advantaged members of society? If the answer to these questions is yes, then the inequalities are fair. And the difference principle, which will be agreed to in the original position, says that these inequalities are just. If the answer is no, then these inequalities are unfair. So the difference principle really regulates number 1, 3, and 4 on the list of primary social goods. So again, it's better to think of rights as prerogatives or powers. These can be distributed unequally. Things like, the elected office person's prerogative to vote on legislation. These can be distributed unequally, but they are subject to the two conditions in the difference principle: fair equality of opportunity and benefiting the least advantaged members of society. Opportunities have to be distributed under conditions of fairness and equality. This is that first clause of the second principle. Positions must be open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. Income and wealth can be distributed unequally, but again, subject to the conditions of the difference principle, the second principle. Now, why will the contractors agree on these two principles, the EBL principle, equal basic liberties, and the difference principle? Well, they'll accept some social and economic inequalities because they're self-interested, right? I mean, they would prefer to have better prospects than to have worse prospects. So they'll roll the dice and take the chance that they might have a better position. But they're going to put conditions on those inequalities because they could. Remember, they have to decide while the roulette wheel is still spinning, because they could be the one who ends up in the least advantaged position in society. So in a sense, they're hedging their bets. You know, they know that they're deciding on principles while the wheel is still spinning, and they could end up being Kaylee. They could end up being Brittany. They could end up being Adrialise. They have an equal chance of having any of these less advantaged positions as ending up in the more advantaged positions. So they're going to hedge their bets and try and make the least advantaged positions as well off as possible because they could end up in that position. Now, these two principles, Rawls thinks that these two principles accomplish some important things. So it's a given that there's always going to be inequalities between people due to, again, the lottery, right? Good luck or bad luck in the DNA lottery, the birth lottery. I mean, Rawls's brothers had weaker constitutions than him. That was just good luck on his part. He ended up with a stronger physical constitution. There's going to be inequalities between people. But these two principles at least make the playing field fair. The central idea of Rawls's approach to justice is fairness. Justice as fairness. So people with advantages shouldn't, he thinks, be able to continue accruing advantage at the expense of the least advantaged. Their advantages should provide some compensating benefit for the least advantaged members of society. That's the key idea of fairness. So the original position as a thought experiment shows a few things, according to Rawls. One is that we're being either irrational or wrongly, unjustly partial toward ourselves rather than being impartial if we accept any inequalities in the distribution of basic liberties and the social bases of self-respect. So that's just irrational, or it's being wrongly partial toward yourself if you accept that. And we're also being irrational or partial toward ourselves if we accept unfair inequalities in the distribution of opportunities, income, wealth, and prerogatives and powers. Now, it's really the second principle that is most relevant to the study of poverty. The first principle, equal basic liberties, is a really important principle. A lot of people have talked about it, but it's basically an equal rights principle. It's really the second principle that's most relevant for our class. So what I'm having you read from Rawls's theory of justice are the sections where he deals with 4 possible interpretations of the second principle. So really honing in on the second principle. He thinks there are several ways to understand the difference principle. He calls these natural liberty, liberal equality, natural aristocracy, and democratic equality. And he comes down firmly, spoiler alert, he comes down firmly on the side of democratic equality as an interpretation of the difference principle. So as you read the selection for today, keep an eye out for why it is that he prefers this interpretation of the difference principle and what that might mean in terms of inequality in a society, in terms of how the difference principle would regulate those inequalities.